Hi, I'm Nadia and I'm Artistic Director of Theatre Royal Stratford East.
And I'm Adam Penford, Artistic Director of Nottingham Playhouse. Hello, Nadia.
Hello, Adam.
This is lovely. It's so nice to be hanging out on Zoom together.
Or is it? I'd much rather be in a room with you, but this is the new normal, so it's fine.
That's absolutely right. I was trying to think before how long we sort of known each other and where we met.
It was a while ago. I think it was at the National Theatre, definitely. And I'd been assistant director to Nick Heitner for a few years. And then there was a new kid in town, and that was you. And I was like, who is this person? And I was determined to hate you, of course. No, but you were so lovely and brilliant and funny. And that's where we got, I think that's where we became friends.
Oh, I think that's right.
And now we run buildings in Nottingham and East London, proper grown-ups now.
We've grown up, haven't we? It's scary.
Apparently, yeah. So, when you told me about this idea of the revival, I thought it was genius, especially wanting to talk about work and remember making work when our theatres are closed. So where did the idea come from?
Yeah, so I was inspired by a long-running Radio 4 documentary programme called The Reunion, which brings together a group of people who all played a part in a certain moment of history together. So it could be, I don't know, the Olympic Games or the miners' strike or something. And it brings together, so for example, miners, people from the coal board, MPs, a newsreader. So you look at something from a 360-degree angle. And I thought how amazing it would be if we did that with an important or landmark theatre production that we were associated with. And
Bring
so
the band back together somehow.
Exactly, get the band back together. And that could be creatives, actors, writers, directors, but it could also be somebody who played a part in helping with the cultural or historical context, like a historian or someone who was part of the research of the show, to really offer a fully rounded view of that production. And I thought the first episode could be The Madness of George III, which I directed. And we had that conversation yesterday, didn't we, bringing the cast back together. The Madness of George III by Alan Bennett premiered at the National Theatre in 1991. Starring Nigel Hawthorne as the King and directed by Nicholas Heitner, the play was a huge hit, touring the UK and transferring to America. Hawthorne's performance was described in Variety as a masterful blend of integrity, compassion and humour. He was joined in the 1994 film adaptation by Helen Mirren. The movie was nominated for 4 Oscars.
The play explores a period during George's reign when he battled mental illness. The royal doctors prescribed the torturous medicines of the time, including blistering and laxatives. As the King's illness worsens, the Prime Minister, William Pitt, tries to hide the truth from Parliament, whilst government grinds to a halt.
Meanwhile, the King's eldest son, the Prince of Wales, has his eye on the throne and teams up with Pitt's opposition to try to force the Regency Bill through Parliament, which recognises that the King is no longer fit to govern and grants the Prince power instead. He also ensures his mother, the Queen, is no longer able to see his father. Dr. Willis is brought in, who specialises in mental illness, but can he cure the King in time?
In 2018, The Madness of George III was produced at Nottingham Playhouse. The production was described as sensational, phenomenally good and theatrical gold, with the Telegraph critic declaring, "By George, Mark Gatiss has got it." The production was broadcast into cinemas worldwide via NT Live, one of the first theatres outside of London to do so.
We're joined today by Mark Gatiss, who played the role of George III, Adrian Scarborough, who played Dr. Willis, Debra Gillett, the Queen, Sara Powell as Lady Pembroke, Adam Karim, who played Fortnum, and Professor Arthur Burns from the Georgian Papers Project, whose knowledge of the period greatly helped the cast and creative team during production.
Mark, George III, a very challenging role, closely associated with Nigel Hawthorne, who played the role originally on stage and in the movie. So what was your original reaction when I phoned and offered you the project? Did you know the play?
You asked me in person, as I remember, in the dressing rooms at Park Theatre when we were doing Boys in the Band. I was It's weird, isn't it? I remember being thrilled actually by the idea. Intimidation set in later on the way home, I suppose. But I'd never thought of it. I've played a couple of kings, Charles I, George IV, and but it hadn't really been on my radar, despite the fact I'm a huge and long-term fan of Alan Bennett. And so I was just glad you thought of it, really, I suppose. And then obviously the legacy is very, the shadow is very long, as it were, of the great Nigel Hawthorne. So I never saw it. I knew the film. I never saw the play, but I'd read it several times. I remember reading the introduction where how Alan talks about the fact he was drawn to George because he was a dull king, which is a quintessentially Bennett thing to do. And he had the dullest court in Europe and stuff like that. But it was the humanity, obviously, is what appealed to him. And I think that's what appealed to me as well. It's really two things. It's the idea of the person representing the country, the man as monarch representing the health of the nation. But much more important than that, it's just the personal thing, I think. That's why, for me, a film like The King's Speech is much more interesting about George VI's personal struggle than it is that he's the monarch. It's just about what people go through. And I think what the play does brilliantly is just strip away all that and show the torment and the agony that the family went through, really, and everybody around him went through. I think it's just a fascinating piece of work. So I was, thrilled and scared.
And a moment to acknowledge the beauty of your backdrop there.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this old thing. Well, this is my home in Barnard Castle, which I just popped up to. Hang on. There we go. That's better. Now I can see it.
Well, I've got a question for Arthur. We know Alan Bennett studied history, read history at Oxford, I think, and they were the original letters at the Windsor Library. But and he struggled, I think, at first about deviating from the real historic facts and making a juicy drama. So I want to ask you, how are George, the theatrical George, and the real George III, are they similar or very different?
I think they're quite similar. I mean, one of the things I was struck when Mark and I went round Windsor together looking at the documents, and I'd not read the play for some time before that, and I went back and looked at it again, how many of the phrases in that in the play actually come straight out of the document or capture the resonance or the rhythm of the voices you see there, and that rather took me aback, actually, because he didn't see the original letters on the whole. What he saw were other people's accounts of them or listening to historians talking about them, and I think he captures that really well. He squashes people together, often in rather uncomfortable ways. So Lady Pembroke has got bits of other people in, and so have some of the doctors, because there are rather more doctors around in the original. But I think the flavour of the interactions works really well. The one thing that's very striking is it is slightly of its date in terms of its account of what the illness is. And that you could imagine the play looking very different on that. And I actually, working with you all, made me understand that in a way I hadn't understood it before. I'm now writing about that. And, you know, the porphyria diagnosis, this idea that it was this kind of physical ailment rather than a kind of manic depression thing. Actually, if you look at the plotting, it's all about the manic depression. And the diagnosis is sort of just stuck on at the end, because the books Alan read to get the plot were ones written at the time and everyone thought it was manic depression. But he was writing it at the point when the opinion had moved to porphyria. So it's really interesting how that diagnosis is sort of there, but not quite there in the play. But apart from that, I think it just captures so much. And it's partly because when Alan was at university, it was the high point of the study of this stuff. So everybody was right on top of this material. And I think he was taught by Richard Pears, one of the great historians of this. So that comes through, I think.
As you were saying there, Arthur, that Alan was a historian. And that influenced his interest in wanting to write the play. But he also drew on his personal life. And I was thinking, Debs, about there's a bit in Alan's book where he talks about his mother had a mental illness, and his father used to drive 50 miles every day to the hospital to visit his mum in hospital. He was that devoted. And it was because Alan puts it in the play. He says that how will the doctors know when my mum is better, because they don't know what she was like before she was ill. And the Queen has a line really similar to that. How can the doctors restore him to his proper self, not knowing what that self is? It struck me that the relationship between the King and the Queen, although there's a formality there, there's a true love, I would say. Would you agree with that?
Completely. And I really feel that you got that from the letters as well, when you were going through them, and the intimacy are very conversational, and they were a real team. She got what the deal was to be his wife. I was looking back over the research that we did, and that she'd sort of written him a fan letter, and then he decided that that's the woman that he would marry, even though he had other women that they thought he would marry. And I knew that he was a bit sort of shocked when he saw her. She was a bit of a fright, but she was his homie. That's what I really loved, is that she didn't question. She gave advice. She knew what the gig was. She gave him 15 children. She was quite mighty in that respect.
That's one thing the play gets right more than some of the historiography that was written before the play, actually, where the Queen's a rather dismissed figure. There's endless reference to the fact she's ugly and so on. And I think the play helped put her back in the centre of the picture in a way that later people writing about her have actually done rather more with.
Yeah, the fact that they were quite domesticated. I know they were considered boring, but the living at Windsor and the walks, the church every day, the setting off as family to go strolling. I mean, quite simple pleasures, which is really touching.
It's very touching, I think, and it is really the foundation of the idea of a modern monarchy, and more. It's like a Scandi novel, a Scandi model, isn't it, of how it's supposed to be. And much more so than our current regime is, in a way. It's like a sort of really tight unit.
And another relationship that I find is really fascinating is between the women, the Queen and Lady Pembroke. And obviously when the King is going through his breakdown, he makes all these really overt advances, sexual advances to Lady Pembroke. And what do you think that Sara, the relationship is between the two women? Is it one of sort of respect or friendship or solidarity, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it was pretty straightforward friendship and support, really. I always thought that the Queen would not, it's, that position can be very lonely. You've got to choose the people around you quite carefully. And I always thought that Lady Pembroke had been chosen for her utter fidelity and friendship. And, at the end of it, she was rewarded, Lady Pembroke, with a fabulous house in Richmond, to which she lived out the rest of her days. She was very, she was very loyal, and she was very well rewarded for it at the end. I went and had tea there one day with my mum. It is actually absolutely stunning. What? Yeah. It was like, this was a good reward for all that molestation and abuse. This was worth it. Look at what I've got. It's fantastic. Really beautiful house she was given to live out the rest of her days in. But I do think it was always it was pretty uncomplicated support and faithfulness and trust to the Queen. I
suppose the complexity around the royal family and then the politicians, the MPs, and then all the servants doing their duties. That it's very complex that we had to build that into the stage picture, Adam. And I was reading the other day Nick Heitner's sort of autobiography, and he tells this brilliant anecdote that someone who was an equerry at Buckingham Palace once approached him and said, when we're training, we're told to watch the film of the Madness of George III in order to learn how to stand, how to bow correctly, how to enter and exit the room correctly. How did you know the historical truth of what all that was? And Nick had to reveal to him that they just made it up. It was just pure theatre. It was movement, I mean, I suppose we spent quite a bit of time on that, didn't we? Playing one of the footmen. How did it feel to do all that etiquette, and also standing around for long periods of time? It was watching the NT live and the close-ups that I really began to see the level of detail between the footmen when they're through glances, how much inner life is going on when they're not allowed to express anything? How was that as an actor?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess it's kind of useful in a way, having those kind of rules set up gives you something to work with and to choose when you break it then as well, doesn't it? So as a team, you have strict rules. You can't look at the king in the eye and things like that, I remember. But as the condition worsens and we have to bend and break some of these rules, it's interesting then for the three of us about who did what. Pappendick, who's like the very loyal one, Billy, who like reveled in the sadism, I think, and then Fortnum, myself, was more interested in pinching the candles and setting up a shop as soon as possible.
It is a good joke, isn't it, that he's gone off to set up a provision merchants in Piccadilly. It's a good line. But true.
It's true, yeah, it's true. He did they insisted on fresh candles every day, and so he was taking the leftover ones and plugging them.
The very best thing about being king is to not have to do any of that movement. It was, my heart flooded with joy, and I realised I didn't have to bow to anybody, or even, it's just marvellous.
My question's for Adrian, and I think we first met on Habit of Art, one of Alan's plays.
Yeah.
You've done tons of Alan Bennett. What makes Alan's work so special? What do you love about it?
I love the fact that it's so domestic. That's the thing that always makes me smile. It just comes from a familial, domestic place. I love the fact with this play that it's, you know, that essentially it becomes about the way that the royals behave, you know, in a day-to-day setting, in a castle or in a palace, or, you know, with their politicians. It all becomes about, well, good health for sure, but but it's demonstrated so brilliantly through sniping, mostly between father and son, and just about marriage and just about relationships between people, which, you know, Alan writes, I think, completely brilliantly.
So wow. I mean, he does this thing between ordinary and extraordinary, like, you know, everyday people being extraordinary, and then extraordinary kings and queens being ordinary, and he's good at that. Yeah,
and very witty,
and
along with it,
bloody hilarious.
Adrian, you once told me of a technique during rehearsals, I don't know if you remember this, that if you've got to speak, if you're doing an RP speaking character in an Alan Bennett, that there's a way to access the line if it doesn't quite scan. Do you remember what that was?
Did I say do it as Alan Bennett?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true. You can try out any line really as Alan Bennett to see if it works, and it's incredibly helpful because he has a very, very particular lilt and a way of speaking, and particularly as he's got older as well, it's sort of become much more whiny the older he's got, and it's also a bit more lispy now because probably because his teeth aren't so good anymore. I don't know, but yes, it just to have that tune in your head is a very, very wonderful way of being able to bring it to life. I think it helps me.
Do Hamlet. Do Hamlet as Alan Bennett.
Oh, to be or not to be, that's the question. Whether it's nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them.
See, I'd listen to that for hours.
Rather bloody good. I wanted to talk a bit about how you approached the king, Mark, and I thought it was absolutely completely disarming the way you did it physically. I used to work in a mental health hospital, and I just felt so like how vulnerable and human he is when he's at his illest, if you like, and how you feel his humanity the more vulnerable he is. It was extraordinary, and a brilliant performance. How did you begin? How did you approach the whole thing?
Well, I suppose partly, of course, it's to not be like Nigel Hawthorne or David Haig or anyone else who played the parts. You want to do something different. But I was sort of, because I went to Windsor before we in the middle of rehearsals. Actually, I was quite heartened by the fact that really nobody knows exactly what was wrong with him anymore. The porphyria diagnosis is kind of slightly debunked, isn't it, Arthur? And it's as a breakdown, it seemed to me the possibilities were kind of endless. And the weird thing for me is I've spent half of my entire career denying the fact that being brought up opposite a mental hospital had any influence on me whatsoever, because it's brought up in every single interview I ever do, and because it's a Wikipedia entry, and this unassuming 1930s mental hospital has assumed the proportions of Arkham Asylum in the popular imagination. But for this one, extraordinary, it was exactly what I drew on, because I worked there as a gardener, and I knew a lot of the patients very well, and I drew on all sorts of them, a lot of the tics and a lot of the strange sorts of manifestations of different kinds of mental illness. I drew on directly, some of the physical stuff as well. I suppose it was that. It was really just, I thought, well, he has a colossal collapse of some sort, and it manifests itself. Some of it is essentially Tourette's, isn't it? It's he says and does the wrong thing. He's subconsciously very attracted to Lady Pembroke, and then when the veils are down, he just goes for it. And you see that sort of thing all the time in people with various sorts of mental illnesses. The filters go, and suddenly everything's up for grabs, literally, sometimes. So it was that, really. I just thought, I think it's this colossal strain of it. In a way, he's like a lot of monarchs, like George VI, actually, he's not really cut out for it, but he has a tremendous sense of duty and religious duty too. And I think he just cracked. I mean, he just couldn't stand the strain of it. And then, of course, I think he says that actually giving into it is incredibly liberating. But at the point where Dr. Willis starts to suspect that he's actually slightly putting it on, it's because it's a bit like lockdown. We don't really want to stop now, because some of it's lovely. And you actually just, there's an amazing liberation from putting on the straight waistcoat, because it allows you, weirdly, it frees you at the same time.
I found after you've done this, I've started reading the later instances of his mental illness in the 1810s, when the doctors again still writing daily reports, and every day he does a religious ceremony there before he eats. He effectively does his own little communion ceremony, and he's still talking about Lady Pembroke all the time. And that's happening till 20 years after this. Wow. So it's very striking just how deep seated all this is, I think, in terms of his psyche.
The one that got away.
Yeah.
Arthur, do you want to just expand slightly on the diagnosis? Because when Alan first wrote it, the play ended with a modern day doctor coming on stage and talking about the
Ida McAlpine.
Yes, and saying that we now believe he had porphyria. That's right, isn't it? And I heard Nigel Hawthorne hated that scene and demanded it was cut, although Alan includes it in the published edition. So where are we at now? Because that's also been debunked, hasn't it?
So I think we're slightly a house divided at the moment. So there are certainly some people who still think the porphyria diagnosis is a very strong one. There was a lot of work done on genetic evidence in the 1990s, including various people going around Eastern Europe finding deceased German princesses who could be disinterred to check their DNA on this. And they also wrote to crowned heads of Europe asking for stools in the best Dr. Pepys tradition. And one of them sent some, astonishingly. And so they tested all those. But the other side of the argument, which is to look at it as mania or something related to manic depression, has begun to make a bit of a comeback. Some very detailed work along those lines. I guess my own feeling, having read a lot of this now, and I'm writing about the 200 years of interpretation just at the moment, is how much does it really matter in the sense that the lived experience of it seems to me the key. I mean, very much what Mark was saying, that it's very hard to avoid the points of contact with his life. And even some of the weird stuff he does, so he goes around marrying everybody offering new combinations all the time, and talking to people who've been long dead, including his children. And so that whatever it is, it's rooted in his life in terms of how his mental life is proceeding when he's unwell. And I think actually the question of what caused it belongs to a kind of medical history. It's not really the only kind of history that matters here. It's important, it's worth finding out, but it doesn't tell us very much, I think, about George's experience. And we have so much stuff on this now that we can just explore. It's very rich material, some of it available for the first time.
And of course, the 3 doctors in our production were all played by female actresses. So we had gender blind casting, but we also had colour blind casting, deaf and disability blind casting. It was a very diverse production, which was really interesting because that was generally really well received. A few people wrote in about historical accuracy, not just of that, of anything to do with props or costumes. So I suppose I'm sort of conscious of the fact that against the backdrop of Black Lives Matter at the moment, it feels like we're making steps forward as theatre in terms of representation, but there are probably still more to be made. Sara, is that right? Do you think we've made good steps?
I think that's fair. I think I remember when this came out. Actually, it was shortly after Madness of George III. The original production was either while I was at drama school or just after I'd left drama school, and I went to see it, and it was, brilliant and enchanting, and we all absolutely loved it. But I sat there, and there were 2 women on stage and no black people, and you just accepted that there was no place on that stage in this kind of drama for someone who looked like me, or who looked like Nadia, or who looked like Joshi or Adam. There's just no place for us. It was brilliance, and there was nothing for us. So this production, I particularly loved the 3 women doctors. They just cracked me up every time they were on stage. And no reference was made to it, but each one of them, Louise just being so vicious, and Amanda is just sort of bumbling around as Peeps with her stool. They were just so beautifully, they embodied those characters so beautifully, with nothing addressed about their sexuality. They were just brilliant actors, and Stephanie portraying those roles, and suddenly they were there. Adam was there, I was there, and it was
also any young people that I met that didn't know the original. They just assumed they never questioned that it was. They just thought they were women doctors. They just accepted it. It wasn't something that was wrong about it or strange or anything. It was just, they were brilliant, those characters.
And they were just beautifully imagined. Nadia as Fitzroy, so manipulative and devious and horrible. Without, it was just such a beautiful characterization of that role. That yes, it does feel that we've I think there are steps. There's a long way to go, obviously. But
I thought it was really interesting that it worked so well as an audience member, that you could both look a very historically authentic production, and I thought it really did look authentic in all kinds of ways, and also have this approach to casting at the same time without there being any sort of tension between that. I thought that was really interesting. Maybe wigs help in that way in this one, since the extent to the costume everybody's in. Maybe it was where the join worked, but I thought it was wonderful. And as you say, you just didn't think about it at all watching.
The wigs were fantastic.
It's not just the right thing to do. I think it just makes theatre richer and more relevant to young people. And you just, whenever we sit down, we suspend our disbelief and we go with the show. And it just makes it a lot more alive, I think, especially for new audiences. So
it also feels incredible. I think theatre is about 25 years ahead of the movies and TV, isn't it? It's something. It really is just creeping into TV and films, which are things that we used to do. I don't know if you remember them. But theatre has really led the way. And I absolutely, as you say, it's a much richer experience. Also, you sit in the audience, you see yourself, you see the possibility you can get there. Yeah. It's the same as a class division. If you don't think it's possible, you don't enter the thought doesn't enter your head. You think, that's not for me. And if you just go, my God, look, it's all there in front of me, it's all possible, then you're making that step onto the stage yourself in 5, 10, 15 years, whatever. It's vital.
What did you want
Gave
to
us
say, Adam?
as well. I remember Sara at the beginning, by casting a wider range and having that extra richness, it means we can tell more of a story as well. So at the beginning, with the confrontation with the king, we have a citizen of the empire there, and that was another piece of the historical story, just through presentation, that you don't have if you just have an all-white cast.
I'd forgotten about her actually,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad that we made that choice, Adam.
Yeah.
That we made that she was, you know, we had a lot of discussion about madness, didn't we, and what madness was or what mental illness were, and the thought that this woman may actually have had something in the Caribbean that she felt was owed to her, and nobody else believed her. And what does that do to a human? And you know, trying to kill the old king with a butter knife, sorry,
Fruit knife.
I was really pleased that we had made that choice, because the alternative was my trying to do a Geordie accent.
That's right. We had a lot. We had some accent workshops, didn't we, Sarah?
It would have enlightened.
Very good.
Life would not have enriched, I feel, the ultimate final production.
Adrian, I've got a question from the fans.
Yeah.
Dr. Willis doesn't come on till about halfway through.
Just before the end of the first half.
Yeah. What do you do with yourself in the dressing room? What's going on?
You sit there and you get very, very frightened.
Oh, because the tannoy's on.
Because the tannoy's on, but also you're watching everybody coming and going and doing their thing and doing it brilliantly, and they're all sort of hyper and in it and up there, and yes, you get really, really scared. But what I did do, I shared a dressing room with the polymath that is Lord Gatiss, and I would make his tea for the interval.
It's good to be the king.
So I would go and I would, before I made my entrance, I would fill the kettles up for the interval, and I would set the biscuits out and the mugs, and I would put the tea bags in the mugs, and I would sort of try and settle my head by doing something completely different.
Keeping busy.
Rituals, it's rituals, isn't
exactly.
it?
But I tell you what's wonderful about it is that you get to hear it every night. And because that dialogue is so juicy and so rich and so lovely, there were loads and loads of bits that by the end of the show, I was sort of reciting off pat, because you'd heard them so many times, I just kind of knew them. And now I quote the play continually at home. There are things now that have just sort of become part of common parlance in our house. Because they're just so fabulously quotable. It's great.
And of course, the other thing you did, Adrian, was made an earlier sneaky appearance, didn't you?
Well, we don't like to talk about that.
We will.
I did make an appearance right at the very beginning of the play. But yeah, 10 quid for the person who can spot me.
It's push and pull, isn't it? That counts, I think.
That's an old actor's joke, isn't it? I don't think recent graduates know what push and pull is.
That's another thing that's gone.
Yeah.
Recent grads listening, that's when you got paid a little bit extra to move the scenery around. Doesn't really exist anymore. Debs, I rewatched the NT Live recently, and it struck me watching the play that it's partly about information management. So the MPs are very conscious of exactly how much the public and the rest of the Parliament are knowing about this seriousness of the illness. That strikes me as being incredibly contemporary. So whether it's about fake news, or how you're presenting yourself on Twitter, or even when Boris Johnson was ill, how ill was he? Was he able to govern the country? Who was in charge during that period of time? I don't know if you agree that it feels like it resonates in terms of that.
Completely feels like nothing has changed at all. We don't really know what's going on. You still feel there's a whole world that we are not. They're making decisions about us and we don't know, and it's very much that. And even the Queen doesn't know and the King doesn't know. It feels in the play that there's just levels and levels of information. It's very hard to get to the core of it.
Yeah. And actually,
it's also, Mark, I'm thinking, just before we went into rehearsals, there was an article in, I think it was the New Yorker, where somebody called it the ultimate Brexit play. They said the King's nervous breakdown is mirroring our national nervous breakdown around that. And it feels like it resonated in that way. And I remember specifically, you had mentions of Europe in the text, didn't you?
Yeah.
This is this is a great joy of theatre, and I remember Debra. Remember when we were doing 3 days in the country, the National Theatre, and I used to come on with Debs at being the second act, and drenched. We used to pour water on ourselves, and I had to take off my hat and say "summer," and throughout that play, that got a huge laugh in the middle of the summer because the weather was terrible, and as it shaded into autumn, it got better. The laugh went away. It was fascinating. And in George III, there was one particular matinee, I think, when there was an absolute spike of news about Brexit, and I had to say to Bish, "What of Europe, Mr. Pitt? Nobody has mentioned that yet." And it was the response was extraordinary. I mean, it was like the biggest laugh the theatre's had in 100 years, and then. Even by the Monday, it had slightly dropped because it was just, that's the most wonderful thing. It's sometimes without any, I mean, I might have lifted the line a little, but without any pushing, events just crowd in on and suddenly give it a resonance you just didn't expect. It was wonderful. It was amazing.
Yeah.
It charted it through the run.
The NT Live version actually is one of the nights where it doesn't get a particularly struck. So I was thinking ahead for that when I was watching it again, and it doesn't. I remember when I saw it in this form back in the 1990s, it was the Prince Charles lines that got the laughs then, all that the Prince of Wales predicament stuff, because that's the stuff that felt really topical then. Now it's
fascinating. I think it also means that every play or all good plays have a life which is also unpredictable. You could put a play aside for 20 years and think, oh, that's had its day, and suddenly turn it over and go, oh my God, it's incredibly relevant. I think that's what happened with Journey's End when David Grindley rediscovered it. It was a sort of sixth form war horse, and then suddenly you read it, just go, this is the most incredibly beautiful piece of work, and a great play. I think like George has that. It can be all kinds of things, really.
I was going to ask about, I remember being an assistant on the very first NT Live, actually, Adrian, The Habit of, was it The Habit? No, it was Phaedra at the National. And I know actors talk about doing an NT Live being a bit weird. Debra, could you talk about what it's like doing an NT Live as opposed to doing the play, or is it the same?
I think it is weird because you are playing to the house. So you have a performance that fills the theatre, but then you're aware that there's a camera. So one fears that it's just too big, too much what you're doing, because you're allowing for things to resonate, to fill the auditorium. So I've always felt anxious about that. I'm never quite sure where you pitch it. I know you're always sure, oh, do it as you would always. But then I have watched it, and I'm so impressed by everybody that you kind of do need for it to be taking in the house, because it is a piece of theatre, but you feel like you're there in it, watching in a theatre. So weirdly, I think it really works. I won't worry so much about it if I do one again, because I've watched other ones and thought there's something so thrilling about the sound of the auditorium filling up, and it does give you the excitement of live. You're just terrified if you do something wrong or you forget something, you drop it because it's there forever. You don't want to fuck it up for everybody. That's the thing.
But they really do work. I think they are theatrical, but then you get the close up every so now and then. And then I remember a sideways eye that Adrian did in A Habit of Art, which is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my entire life, is sideways eye that you'd never see if you were sitting 10 rows back. So I think they are special in some way.
It's scary though, aren't they? I mean, we were so relieved. The relief when it's over. This is a very strange experience for all of us, because it was a very short run. Really, it was just under a month, and we actually managed to. We had essentially like 5 opening nights, because there was a gala, there was the press night, there was the opening night, there was NT Live. It was like, and I think we had a dress rehearsal for NT Live, which we ended up sort of doing 6 shows in about 48 hours. It was absolutely relentless. And then, of course, you get to the end of the live thing. It's just, oh my God, thank God we've just got to do the show now. And then it was only on for about another week. So it was a strange experience, really.
I thought it must be hardest for those who were doubling up parts. Whereas I guess if you've got the distance in an auditorium, where you're getting very close up sort of face shots of the way you're acting, and you're trying to differentiate 2 parts, that must be particularly difficult, I'd have thought. But again, I was struck it didn't bother me when I watched it.
I was thinking that, Adam, because you get to play one of a footman, and then you get to play a second footman for the enemy, don't you, for the prince.
Yeah. I remember. I can't remember if it was Amanda or Louise coming back to the dressing room in a completely different costume, going, "I don't think I was meant to be the doctor."
But it's one of the joys of NT Live, and you know, it's been great to hold this conversation because it's coinciding with the National Theatre re-releasing The Madness of George III for people to watch it around the world. Mark, Arthur, Adam, Deborah, Sara, Adrian, on behalf of Nadia and I, thank you so much. It's been lovely to have you, and we've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
What?
Thank you.
What? Hey, hey.
Hey, what?